Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 1 in our study of Genesis chapter 20. And if you were with us last time, you remember we were closing out chapter 19, and we had been looking at the dilemma of Lot and his two daughters. And so we saw the situation they had found themselves in. They had left the town of Zoar because Lot said he feared to dwell there. It wasn't a safe place, it wasn't a good environment. So they went to the mountain. They found a cave to dwell in, and then over the course of time, his two daughters had schemed and put together a plan, and we looked at those aspects of that. But what the result was is each one became with child by their father. And so that's what they had done. They'd gotten their dad drunk with wine, and on 2 separate nights they lay with him, and then they both became pregnant with sons. Each one had son, and it goes on to tell us who those sons would be. One would be the head of the Moabites, and the other one would be the head of the Ammonites. So that's where we left off. And one thing that I wanted to address was the issue of Lot before we close out that chapter, because we had saw and we talked about the daughters and the influences that they had and the possible reasoning that they had of doing what they did. But the fact that they were justifying it, and the fact that they were going to do something, what they would say was immoral and it was sinful, but the end result, the way they were looking at it, was going to be good, in the fact that they were going to preserve the seed of their father, because in their minds and in their actions, they said that there was no man that would be available to come in unto them, and that they were the only bastion of hope of their father having offspring that could carry on the name and carry on the lineage. And so they justified that in their own minds and in their own hearts, and they'd made that decision to go through with it, and that's what they did. But we didn't want to let Lot completely off the hook, because what we were talking about was the fact that Lot wasn't completely innocent in this ordeal. Even though the Bible tells us that he perceived not what had happened. And it also makes you kind of wonder, well, when did he find out about what happened? I mean, did they go on to fill him in like shortly after that? Or did they just not share anything with him until it became evident that they were both pregnant, and then had some explaining to do? Because he would certainly want to know, well, how did you get that way, and who's the father, and so forth, and then the truth would have to come out. But Lot wasn't completely innocent in this matter, because he had allowed himself to be put in that situation. And a lot of people that find themselves, even Christians that find themselves in bad situations or bad circumstances, sometimes you got to look back and say, well, what put me in that circumstance in the first place? And even in the world's crowd, you think about a lot of these folks you see that they get, in bad situations with the police, or they're in bad circumstances and they're getting arrested, and then they cry out about police brutality or whatever. But the thing is nobody ever addresses the issue. Well, how did they get in that position in the first place? If they weren't breaking the law in the first place, or if they weren't under suspect, or they didn't have a outstanding warrant, or they weren't involved in domestic violence, there was something that caused the police to have to come out in the first place. And then maybe some things resulted from that were in the wrong. But again, if they wouldn't have put themselves in that situation, then the whole event could have been avoided to begin with. And so it is with Lot here. If he hadn't allowed himself to be put in this situation, then most likely the whole incident and the whole ordeal could have been completely avoided. But whether they just offered him a glass of this wine maybe after dinner or something, and they were having conversation, and they were having fellowship around the table or whatever in the evening, and then maybe the daughters kept pouring him a second glass and poured him a third glass and just encouraged him to do that. But they didn't take a funnel and put it in his mouth and pour it down him. I mean, obviously he was willing, and maybe he thought, well, I'll stop after just one, or I'll stop at and did they carry the wine with them? Was it something they acquired later on? I mean, who knows? But the fact is they had it. And that was another part of it, is the fact that they had the wine on hand. I mean, they could have had water on hand, or they could have had unfermented wine on hand, or they could have had grape juice, or whatever the case is. But the fact that they had it on hand, it's just like modern day. If you've got it in your household, if you've got alcohol in your household, or if you've got alcohol in your refrigerator, and maybe you're saying, well, I'm strong and I only do social drinking and I'm only going to have a can of beer on occasion, or maybe but I can always stop at just one. I never go on and have a. But the fact that it's there and available is the risk of putting someone in that situation. And so the ideal is not to have it at all, and then you don't have to be concerned about that ever happening. But they had it. It was on hand. It was available. There was enough of it, obviously. And for whatever tactic they used, they caused him to drink it, and they caused him to drink in excess to where he became incoherent. He became unmanageable of his own faculties. And basically the wine had taken him over and made him vulnerable to this situation. So that's what had happened. And Lot shouldn't have, he may not have been willing, obviously, to do this. He wasn't, because it said he perceived not. He wasn't aware. And surely he wouldn't have consented, but he allowed himself to be put in this situation by allowing himself to drink in excess. It always starts with one drink. It always starts with just a social drink. It always starts with just, having a fellowship time with your buddies or with your classmates or whatever the case is, and you're just going to be kind of part of the group, and then one leads to another, and before you know it, you've gone overboard. But it's doubtful that they tied him up. It's doubtful they put a funnel in his mouth and poured it in. And then not only that, but he repeated the performance 2 nights in a row. And so what was the result? Well, the result was the sin of incest was now committed in his very own house. And, we've heard that quote, let him therefore that thinks he stands high and stands firm, let him take heed lest he fall. We're sometimes even more susceptible to Satan's fiery darts of temptation when we are in a place of solitude. We must walk circumspectly even in the midst of our own families to ensure we don't let our guard down. He might have thought he was in a secure environment. He might have thought he was no longer susceptible to the sinful things of Sodom, to the sinful things that he found there in Zoar. He had making that break. He put distance in between him and those sinful places. He put all of these evil people out of reach. He felt like he was now in a protective environment with just him and his daughters. So he probably didn't see any reason to be concerned about having a little wine and maybe drinking a little more than he normally would, because after all, there's nothing here that's going to hurt him. There's nothing here that's going to come upon him. There's nobody's going to take advantage of him here, because it's just family. It's just him and his family. And, when the Bible says to walk circumspectly, it doesn't just say when you're out in public, walk circumspectly. When you're out in a foreign land or in a foreign city or a foreign environment, walk circumspectly. No, it just says to walk circumspectly, and that includes even within your own family, even within your own household. Sometimes family members or relatives can be the most danger. Sometimes family members or relatives can be the ones that will take advantage of you when your back is turned. Or they may even steal from you, or they may borrow something or loan something and say they're going to give it back or pay it back, and they never do. And I'm not saying that's every family member's that way. I mean, probably majority aren't. But some of them are. And you can just watch any of these court shows on TV, and it'll amaze you how many family members are suing other family members, whether it be a cousin or aunt or uncle or even a mother or father. And so there you go. And it's usually resulting over some kind of money matter. Something that they helped them to do that they were supposed to make right and they didn't, or they were supposed to pay back and they didn't. And so that's what happens. But here we see that Lot thought he was in a safe environment, and so he let his guard down. And that's all it took. He let his guard down. He didn't stand and keep his protective measures up. And, Satan found a way to get through to him, even being the godly man that he was. And, so what is it here? Well, we saw him, he thought he was in a safe environment, and he thought he placed himself in a place that would not be perceptible to a fall. And they were in the mountain. But you know, not even the mountain is impenetrable. And so the last thing we see about Lot here was that, once again, we see pointed out the perils of drinking and ultimately the perils of drunkenness. You know, we can justify drinking. We can say that we like its taste. We can say that we only do it in moderation, that it's not going to hurt anybody. We can say that it doesn't have any hold on us. And we cannot, but at the end of the day, it is only simply paving a pathway for other sins to enter in, whether they be great or small sins. It results in even the most righteous person is more prone now to possibly do things or to allow things that otherwise they would in no wise allow. Because the alcohol takes control. And whatever is in control of you, whatever's in you, and whatever is filling you, is taking control of you. And that's why the Bible tells us and warns us, don't be filled with alcohol in excess, but rather be filled ye with the Holy Spirit. Because if you're filled with the Holy Spirit, that's what will be controlling you. That will be controlling your actions. And you know the Holy Spirit is only going to lead you in righteousness. It's not going to lead you astray. And it's also going to make you aware of sinful things that may come upon you or come in your path. You'll be aware of that. And it'll be very noticeable, and you'll be able to avoid those possible pitfalls. But Lot didn't do that. And so Lot finds himself in this predicament. You know, he may have kept himself righteous. He may have kept his daughters pure, even when they were in sinful Sodom. But in the midst of lonely, weak times, with only his daughters by his side, that's when he let his guard down. And unseemly behavior had snuck into the Lot household. And so it is, what do we see? We see that the resultant birth of 2 sons by his 2 daughters. Or would they be considered his grandsons? Either way, it would be true, I guess. Whichever you prefer. But it tells us their names here would be Moab and Ammon. And these would be the eventual fathers of 2 nations. They would be neighboring nations to Israel, and are oftentimes referred to in the Old Testament as the children of Lot. But you know, bad choices and bad mistakes can have far-reaching effects. And you know, you think, well, that sounds pretty good. They're the father of nations. But if you read further about these 2 nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, they turned out to be idolatrous nations. They turned out to be the enemies of Israel. They rose up against Israel. They were a thorn in Israel's side, and it just had far-reaching effects. And the other thing we notice is after this, we really don't read any more about Lot. He just drops off the map. He's no longer significant. And so this would be his legacy. When somebody thinks about Lot, they think about Sodom and Gomorrah, but they also very well are knowledgeable about this incident with his daughters and this sinful thing that happened. And it's recorded in the scriptures for an eternal example, for all to see, all to read throughout the ages are going to be reading about this dismal account with Lot and his daughters. This would be his legacy. This would be how he's forever remembered. No other mention would be made. And herein lies a principle. Drunkenness, as it makes men forgetful, so it makes men forgotten. Drunkenness, as it makes men forgetful, so it makes men forgotten. Many a name, which otherwise may have been remembered with respect, well, what is it? They're buried by it in contempt and oblivion. And so it is. That's a sad legacy to have. Well, with that, we finish up our chapter 19. We're going to pick it up here in chapter 20 and verses 1 through 2. And the Bible narrative turns back to Abraham now, and it says, "And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country, and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, She is my sister. And Abimelech king of Gerar sent, and took Sarah." Now we've talked about before You know, the Bible tells us that Sarah was very fair. And we've talked about she had an extraordinary appearance. She had an extraordinary, beautiful countenance. And it was noticed by all. And even at the age she was currently at, she just was a beauty queen. I mean, she was like, Miss Universe of Mesopotamia or whatever. But that's just the way it is. And she was very noticeable. She was very beautiful. God had really enriched her with the looks. And so Abraham was always concerned when he traveled into these foreign countries. And we saw this one incident before when he went into Egypt. And technically Sarah was his sister because she wasn't the daughter of his mother, but she was the daughter of his father. So in a sense, in a roundabout way, that would be a correct statement, but it was still not a totally truthful statement, maybe a half-truth. But the biggest thing about it was she was his wife. And that was the first and foremost thing, is that she wasn't just his sister, she was his wife. And he just heard a lot about these foreign countries, and he knew their customs. And he was fearful because he knew that in many cases, if they wanted somebody's wife, they would take her by force, and the chances are good that they may, just to make it legal or to make them feel better about it, they would have the husband basically killed. And so that's what Abraham was always thinking of when they traveled. And so here we see another example of that type of situation. They're on the move. What does it say? It says they journeyed from where they were. They went toward the south country, and they set up their tents, and they put it for a dwelling place in the middle of this country between the cities of Kadesh and Shur. And they sojourned in Gerar. Well, here was Gerar, another kingdom, and they had the king there of Gerar, and his name was Abimelech. And he had been privy to their arrival. He had sent out his escorts or his journeymen to go out and investigate the situation. And however it happened, as they do often, as they'd go out and survey the group, and they'd look through the people, and if they could find the king a new wife, then that's what they would do. They would come and report it, and then he would send for them. And so here we have this happen. Abraham had been living in Mamre for nearly 20 years, and now he was once again on the move. He was traveling, and this time he went into the land of the Philistines. What does it say? It says he sojourned in Gerar, the land of the Philistines. Now, why did Abraham all of a sudden, after 20 years, decide now it was time to pack up and move? What was it that caused him to uproot his family and once again become a nomad? Well, first of all, it's possible that the destruction of Sodom could have prompted this action. Perhaps the country round about it was compromised in value and its ability to produce effectively. Maybe it was no longer, the nutritions weren't there for the soil. Maybe the animals didn't have enough food. Maybe some of the things they had been trading with and so forth before with these various cities no longer were available to trade with. Or maybe it was just the desire to escape from the memory of the destruction of it itself. So one can only imagine living in close proximity to a city, say, that was destroyed by an atom bomb, and possibly coming to the same conclusions. It's time to get out of there. The land would be worthless, and it would have far-reaching effects. And if you lived on the outskirts of a place like that, you may just decide, well, I no longer want to live here. I don't want to be reminded of what happened. I don't want to look out and see this dismal situation, this barrenness. And again, it may have cost them their prosperity a little bit because of the marketability and the traverse they had with their goods and so forth and so on. All these towns have been wiped out. Some Jewish writers have said it was because he was grieved at the incident with Lot and his family. He was grieved with what happened between Lot and his daughters and the reproach which the Canaanites cast upon him and his religion because of it. So some Jewish writers felt like he left because of his reputation had been tarnished now, and even his religion because of what had taken place once the word had gotten out. or it simply could be the fact that in a world where God's people are merely pilgrims and strangers, that we cannot always expect us to stay in the same place. Maybe God prompted him to move. And for whatever reason, if he felt led to move, if he felt it was the right thing to do, then maybe they had been thinking about it for a long period of time, but just decided that now was the time. But in this instance, the Bible doesn't really relate that. It doesn't really tell us that God instructed him to move on. But for whatever reason, we see here that they were on the move. They journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. Now, here we have another unique circumstance. What do we see? Well, Abraham, again, as I just mentioned, had put out the word that Sarah was not his wife, but his sister. And of course, being the obedient wife, she would agree to that. He probably instructed all of his household to say the same thing. All of his workers, all of his ranchers, all of those that traveled with him, all of the family members, whoever. And so, he had changed her identity. He had given her an alias. And it was not without cause. In his mind, he was viewing this as a protective measure to ensure her safety, but more than that, to ensure his safety. He knew about the culture in their land, and he had heard about the bandidos, and he had heard that if they overtook and wanted to capture a woman, in order to make it legal, they would often kill the husband. He would be discarded. And so again, this was the second time that Abraham had used this tactic and this strategy. If you remember from chapter 12, they did the same thing when they traveled into Egypt. And we saw there that when Pharaoh had actually taken Sarah into his household, and were it not for God's intervention and bringing the plagues upon them and making them to realize that they were doing the wrong thing, or that he was doing the wrong thing, and that these plagues were brought on by God, and that if that hadn't have happened, then Pharaoh would have taken and consummated that marriage with Sarah. And in that instance, Abraham actually left Egypt. Remember, we told him that he left with more provisions and more abundance that he had gone in with, because Pharaoh wanted to not just give him a high hand of leaving, but to make sure that he showered him with things and with goods and so forth, so he could make sure that God was going to be pleased and take these plagues and remove them from his land. And so even though Sarah is technically Abraham's half-sister, she was still his wife. And through the art of deception, he was in fact telling a half-truth. Just as she was his half-sister, he was telling a half-truth. And a half-truth, what is that? It's a lie. It's deception. He was offering the fact that technically she was his sister, but he was withholding the info that she was in fact his wife. And this would not only put their relationship in controversy, but also make Sarah vulnerable to sacrificing her honor in order to protect his well-being. And that is not a natural function of a husband. So Abraham was not doing the right thing when he did that. And he was putting her in jeopardy and putting her in harm's way. And he saw it, justified it as having the right end result would be that he would be protected. But it could have resulted in something a lot worse and a lot more serious. So here we can notice two truths. First of all, Abraham had been rebuked and reproved for doing this very thing when he was in Egypt. You remember that Pharaoh actually had to rebuke him and reprove him. And Pharaoh was the head of an idolatrous nation, and he was a heathen. He wasn't a godly person, but yet here he was the one that happened to point out Abraham and his faults and said, look, even for someone who says they're a godly person, someone who's purporting this God of creation and trying to live a high pious life and a righteous life and a Christian or a godly lifestyle, and then you do this thing and you bring plagues upon me. What is that all about? And so he should have remembered those things. He should have had that instilled in him by now, but obviously he'd either forgotten, and it had been a while. It had been a while. So, it wasn't as fresh in his mind as it once was. But this would put her in harm's way. And so the first thing we noticed here was that he was rebuked before, and he had been convinced at that time of the unwise decision and the trauma that it caused and what it almost caused. Yet here we see him returning to the same course of action. If we had been corrected in our area of our life, but then revert to the same actions, then we can generally expect the same results that we experienced before. You know, if we don't make a change, if we keep doing the same things that we've been doing, and we expect a different result, then, you know, what we say nowadays is that's the definition of insanity. It just doesn't make any sense to do the same thing you did before. You saw the result of that, and then somehow you think you're going to have a different result this time. Secondly, Sarah is either with child or expecting to be in the near future based on the word of the Lord, because God had told her that she's going to bear Abraham a son. And for this very reason, Abraham should have taken even greater care to ensure her safety and protection. But because of Abraham's actions, what do we see? Well, and I don't think Abraham was tempting God necessarily. I don't think he was just counting on, well, God will get me out of this circumstance. But I think he just thought this time it would work. This time he could get away with it. And maybe just looking for the easier way out, not have to have any kind of confrontation or concern. But what do we see? Well, because of his actions, because of his statements, because of what he did, it says Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So once again, Abraham's greatest fear was realized. And as the manner was, the kings, you know, again, they search out these traveling bands. They seek for attractive women that they could add to their household, either as concubines or as wives. And Sarah had been spotted. She had been inquired about. And it was indicated that she wasn't attached. And so, therefore, she was sent for by the king. And what's the next thing we see? Well, we see that he sent for her and had her brought to his house with the intent on making her his wife. And the danger, even above that, would be the danger of the consummation of the marriage. The sin of one can endanger others to participate, and in some cases unawares. And as we will see once again, God will show his protective hand upon Abraham. God's going to protect Abraham. He's going to see to it that the prophetic message he gave Abraham and his will is going to happen. It is going to be carried out. It is going to happen. And Sarah is going to bear him a child. But, you know, were it not, once again, for God's direct intervention, then the promised seed of Abraham would not be fulfilled. And so it is that now God must needs influence Abimelech to do the right thing, just as he had done with Pharaoh. Well, we'll pick that up in our next lesson. We'll see how God's going to take care of this situation. He's going to influence Abimelech to do the right thing and to return Sarah back to Abraham. And then we'll see what the results of that are going to be. And then we'll see the remaining, we're going to see some upcoming things in the life of Abraham. So we'll check that out. We're in chapter 20, and we'll pick it up in those next verses in our next lesson. We'll hope to see you then. Thanks.